They gathered, dressed in black and pearls, and pressed suits pretending their grief had depth. Some wore sunglasses, though the chapel was dimly lit. Others held tissues they barely used. It looked like mourning, polished performative mourning. They filled the pews at First Baptist Church not because they loved Eleanor Callahan, but because they were waiting for what she left behind. The air smelled of lilies and entitlement. There were murmurs about stocks, about real estate, about who might inherit the lake house or the antique silver, but no one spoke her name with reverence. The coffin sat sealed at the front. Oak wood polished to a mirror arm, shine untouched by fingerprints. A single photo stood beside it, a portrait of Eleanor taken 10 years ago, smiling in her garden. The guests passed it with mechanical nods as if they barely remembered her face. Notably absent from the ceremony was the only person Eleanor ever told her real secrets to, her grandson Asher. His name wasn't in the program. No seat was saved for him. In truth, most had forgotten he even existed. Asher had not forgotten. 100 miles away, he stood alone on a quiet beach in Maine, holding a small velvet box and staring out at the sea. He wasn't wearing black. He wasn't crying. His hands were steady, his face unreadable. In his pocket was a letter that had arrived 2 weeks earlier. It had no return address. Inside, a single sentence in Eleanor's cursive handwriting. When they gather to grieve, let them know who was truly absent. Back at the church, the eulogy was cut short. As the pastor prepared to read a carefully written speech, the screen behind him flickered to life. Gasps rose as Eleanor's face appeared, not in a slideshow, but in a recorded video. She was alive in the footage, dressed in a soft blue cardigan, sitting in a sunlit room. Her voice was steady. "If you're watching this," she said, "then I've finally left this world. But not in the way you hoped. I've watched you all wait for my death like a holiday. You think a funeral is the end. I think it's the beginning of truth." People began shifting in their seats. One of her daughters looked visibly pale. The eldest son gripped the pew tightly. Eleanor continued, "There's someone not here today, not because he forgot, but because you made sure he wouldn't be welcome. You erased him from my life to protect your image. But he's the one who stayed when you all turned away. His name is Asher Callahan, and he is the only one who knew where I truly was." The church fell into silence. Outside, a storm had begun. Rain tapped against the stained glass windows like soft knuckles. The camera zoomed in on Eleanor's eyes in the video. "If you want what I left behind," she said, "you'll have to face the story you buried with me." And with that, the video cut to black. A few guests rushed forward, whispering in confusion. Someone finally opened the coffin. There was no body inside, just a single envelope with Asher's name written on it and a simple note underneath. "This is not your inheritance. This is your consequence." Itai, if this story has stirred something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Heart Stories, where every truth, no matter how buried, has its day in the light. When Asher was 16, his father caught him kissing another boy behind the old greenhouse. It wasn't a moment of rebellion, nor a declaration of war. It was a soft, awkward kiss between two boys who didn't know what to call themselves yet. But Pastor Paul Callahan reacted as if he'd witnessed sin incarnate. That same night, Asher was dragged out of bed and locked in the storm cellar. No food, no light, just the Bible shoved through the trapdoor with a note, "Find your way back to God." He spent 3 days there. On the 4th, his brother Nathan opened the door, not out of mercy, but to record him crawling out, eyes, wild legs shaking. That video would be shared with their congregation a week later under the title, "Deliverance Through Discipline." His mother said nothing. She sat beside her husband in the front pew, smiling tightly as the church applauded. Eleanor, however, did not clap. She stood up mid-sermon and walked out, and for that she was called senile. They took her car keys. They limited her visitors. They said it was for her own safety. But in truth, it was to keep her from reaching the boys she loved more than the reputation of their name. Despite it all, Eleanor found a way. She paid a neighbor's grandson to deliver books and notes to Asher at school. She signed letters as Mrs. Everett and left them tucked inside the sleeves of thrift store jackets she knew Asher liked. In one, she included a key and a map. No explanation, just a promise for the day you decide not to disappear. At 17, Asher left. Not in a blaze of anger, but in quiet resolve. He took the map. He found the old lockbox buried beneath the greenhouse floor. Inside, there was a bundle of letters, faded photos of them together, and a single check made out to him, signed by Eleanor, dated 5 years into the future. No one looked for him. No one called. His name was never mentioned again inside the Callahan house. At family gatherings, when people asked how many grandchildren Eleanor had, the answer was always the same. 3, all married, all perfect. They didn't know she kept a separate photo album hidden inside her piano bench. One that began with a picture of Asher at age 5, holding a bouquet bigger than his head. One that ended with a Polaroid of a boy grown now standing on a rocky beach beside her, wind in his hair, peace in his face. In that final year of her life, Eleanor slipped quietly out of her family's spotlight. She told the world she was moving to a retirement home out west. Instead, she boarded a train to Maine with one suitcase and no return plan. Waiting on the platform was Asher, who hadn't seen her in over a decade, but still wore the bracelet she made him in childhood. She didn't need forgiveness. She only wanted time. They built a life in whispers and old jazz records. She told him everything about the church scandals no one dared mention, about the money funneled into missions that were really favors, and about how she'd quietly moved her estate into a trust years ago. Asher listened, not to judge but to witness. When she grew too tired to hold a pen, he wrote for her. When she couldn't finish her sentences, he filled in the silence with memories they never got to make. And when the time came, because it always comes, she placed one final envelope in his hands and said, "Don't let them bury me before the truth does its job." And now back in Arkansas, the truth had arrived, louder than any sermon, heavier than any inheritance. But they had only just begun to feel the weight of it. Before she died, Eleanor wrote her own obituary. She crafted it not as a farewell, but as a final chess move. One paragraph, short and cold, was submitted to the local paper by her lawyer. Eleanor Ruth Callahan, beloved matriarch, has passed. Service held privately. Family requested privacy during this time. There was no mention of her grandchildren, no list of those left behind, because in her eyes they already had been. While the town read it with mild curiosity, her family read it with a hunger they no longer bothered to hide. Plans were made instantly. Flights were booked. Old suits were dry cleaned. The estate, once a sanctuary of Southern charm and creaking memories, was polished overnight, ready to become someone's prize. But Eleanor had never intended to be buried in that family's memory. She had spent the last year of her life orchestrating her disappearance with more care than any event they'd ever held in her honor. The death certificate was legitimate, but the cause of death was a fabrication. It had taken months of legal maneuvering, sealed records, and one particularly understanding physician. Eleanor understood the consequences, but after a lifetime of being paraded around by people who never truly listened, she was ready to reclaim her ending. She told Asher it wasn't revenge, it was proof. If they loved the real me, they would have noticed I was still breathing, she had whispered one night as the wind rattled the windows of their coastal cottage. Let's see how many cry because I'm gone, and how many cry because they weren't written in. The night before her funeral, Asher boarded a flight to Arkansas, not to attend, but to deliver what she called her final instrument, a sealed package for the church technician. Inside a flash drive and a strict schedule, the man didn't ask questions. Money and clarity tend to erase doubt. Back in Fort Hope, as the congregation stood stunned before Eleanor's posthumous message, Asher watched from a motel room a few blocks away. He didn't feel vindicated. He didn't feel triumph. What he felt was a strange stillness, as if the hurricane that once ripped through his life had passed, and now he stood among fallen branches, waiting for silence to settle. In that same motel room sat a small wooden chest. Inside were the original documents Eleanor had sworn to protect. The real will, the letters, the medical records, and a set of handwritten confessions that had never been mailed, each one addressed to a different family member, each one opening with the same sentences, "I know what you did, even if the others don't." They weren't accusations, they were accounts. Eleanor didn't believe in punishment for the sake of it. She believed in letting truth sting deeper than shame ever could. Asher read them one by one. His father's letter revealed the darkest corner of their family legacy. Years before marrying Asher's mother, Paul Callahan, had been caught in a scandal involving another seminarian. The details were vague, but the trauma lingered. Instead of facing it, Paul turned to fire and brimstone faith, projecting hatred onto others to hide his own history. It was Eleanor who paid the family lawyer to keep the story buried, on the condition that Paul would never raise a hand against Asher. That promise, of course, had been broken. Nathan's letter was even more raw. Eleanor had discovered that the video of Asher crying in the cellar had been monetized online. Her eldest grandson had profited from his brother's suffering. The letter ended with a line scrawled shakily, "If guilt ever finds you, may it stay long enough to teach you the name of what you've done." Each letter carved deeper into the glossy veneer the Callahans had constructed over the years. The God-fearing, upstanding, all-American image was unraveling, and in its place stood a history of silence, convenience, and betrayal. Eleanor had no interest in exposing them to the world. She just wanted them to face themselves, and she trusted only Asher to deliver that mirror. On a cold Tuesday morning, just days after the funeral, that wasn't Asher walked into the law office of Harlan and Lowe. He didn't wear black. He didn't come with a legal team. He came alone carrying the original handwritten will of Eleanor Callahan in a manila folder worn soft at the edges. It was time. The senior partner, Walter Lowe, had been Eleanor's attorney for over 20 years. He greeted Asher not with pleasantries, but with the quiet reverence reserved for messengers of unfinished business. "We'll convene with the family shortly," he said. They requested everything be read in person. Requested, as if they still believed they had the right to demand anything. By noon, the Callahans gathered in the firm's oak-paneled conference room, faces stiff with anticipation. Paul sat at the head of the table like a man who thought he still controlled the room. Nathan scrolled his phone until Lowe cleared his throat. Asher remained near the window, out of their line of sight, but fully in control of the air they breathed. Lowe began to read. The formalities passed quickly. Then came the line that would change everything. "All liquid and real estate assets under my name are to be transferred in their entirety to the Eleanor Ruth Callahan Trust, managed solely by my grandson Asher, who once gave me kindness when I had nothing else left." The silence was immediate and violent. Paul stood up. "That's absurd," he snapped. "She wasn't of sound mind. We can contest." Lowe didn't blink. "You're welcome to challenge it, but you'll find the court won't take issue with the video testimony notarized last fall, in which your mother describes in detail your misuse of family funds and your history of abuse." The room shifted. Suddenly the ceiling felt lower, but it wasn't the money that broke them. It was what came next. One by one, sealed envelopes were handed to each family member. Eleanor's final letters. The confessions Asher had read alone just days before. As each envelope was opened, heads lowered, faces blanched. Paul's hands trembled. Nathan stared at a single photograph. A photograph folded inside his, a printed receipt showing exactly how much he earned from that video of Asher's breakdown. No one spoke. But the moment of reckoning came not from them but from Asher. He stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "I didn't ask for this," he said, "not to gloat, not to punish. I didn't come to humiliate you. I came to finish what she started." He placed a second folder on the table. Inside were the founding papers of a new nonprofit, Eleanor's Second Chances, a foundation dedicated to supporting LGBTQ+ youth estranged from their families. All the estate home stock savings had been routed into its accounts. The only role Asher had taken for himself was unpaid director. Paul's jaw tightened. "So this is what your revenge?" Asher looked at him for the first time in years, not with hatred, not even pity, just resolve. "No," he said, "this is your mirror." Outside the conference room, reporters were beginning to gather. Word had leaked not of the drama, but of the unexpected foundation announcement. Eleanor Callahan, once seen as a conservative symbol of Southern grace, had donated her entire legacy to the very community her family tried to erase. And now her name would be on shelters, scholarships, and safe houses. Not chapels, not family plaques. Asher didn't wait for the press conference. He left through the side exit, stepping out into the afternoon light with nothing in his hands. He had returned to the town that once locked him away in a cellar, only to rise through a door no one expected him to hold the key to. And behind him, the family who tried to bury both him and Eleanor in silence was now left sitting in a room full of open letters and no inheritance to speak of. Just the weight of truth, just the cost of forgetting. 2 months later, a quiet ceremony took place, not in a church, but on the rocky coast of Maine, where the wind carried the scent of salt and unfinished dreams. There was no organ music, no sermons, just waves, wind, and a circle of strangers who had once stood in the dark, like Asher once did, cast out, erased, forgotten. They weren't family by blood, but they were family by story. The plaque they unveiled that morning was simple: in memory of Eleanor Ruth Callahan. She chose truth over silence and love over legacy. Behind it stood the new headquarters of Eleanor's Second Chances. A weather-worn cottage restored by volunteers now bore rainbow-tinted glass panels and warm yellow paint. Inside, bunk beds and shared journals. A communal kitchen, a wall of letters written to no one and read by everyone. Asher lived there now, not as a martyr, but as a steward. He tended the garden Eleanor had planted in her final spring. He answered emails from kids in cities far away, asking if there was a bed, a bus ticket, a place to breathe. He had become quietly what no one in his family had ever tried to be: a safe place. The press tried to spin the story into sound bites. Matriarch leaves millions to gay grandson, or Southern scandal ends in surprise charity move. But they never captured the real weight of it. This wasn't about inheritance, it was about reclamation. Eleanor hadn't simply given Asher money. She had given him the last word in a house that had stolen his voice. And still he didn't shout. He just built. One evening, a young boy named Luca arrived at the shelter clutching a plastic bag with the all he owned. He said almost nothing for days. But when Asher showed him the hidden bench in the garden, the one Eleanor used to sit on at sunset, Luca finally whispered, "She left this for you." Asher shook his head. She left it for whoever needed it next. Sometimes healing doesn't look like a courtroom victory or a public apology. Sometimes it's a hand resting on a stranger's shoulder, a room with your name on the door, a garden you didn't plant blooming anyway. Asher never returned to the Callahan house. He never needed to. But one day a letter arrived from Nathan. No return address. Inside, a photo one Asher had never seen of the two of them as children, arm in arm on a swing set. On the back, a single line: "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I still remember the swing." He didn't write back, but he hung the photo above the bookshelf in the living room. Because memory, like grief, doesn't disappear. It just softens. At the next memorial service, held at the center, Asher stood under the main sky, the sun warm on his skin, and read the words Eleanor had left him for that very occasion. "Family is not who waits for you to fall. It's who builds the ground beneath your feet." That day, a young volunteer added a final stone to the path leading to the garden bench. On it, carved with care, were 4 words: "She died telling truth." And for the first time in his life, Asher didn't feel like someone who had been left behind. He felt like someone who had arrived. Some stories aren't about what we inherit, but what we refuse to pass on. If this ending gave you a moment of breath, share it. Let someone who feels invisible know they're not alone. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had to walk away from your family to become yourself? What truth would you choose to leave behind for the next person who needs it? Subscribe to Heart Stories for more true, powerful stories of healing identity and the quiet bravery of living fully as you are.